Dr. George Nicopolis spent a lot of time here at Graceland. He was a medical doctor first, but his life became defined by Elvis and Elvis's.
For 48 years, one part of Graceland remained completely off-limits, hidden behind a door that fans could only wonder about. Now, Elvis Presley's attic has reportedly been opened, exposing a side of the king that few ever knew existed. What was discovered inside was not simply forgotten memorabilia. There were deeply personal traces of Elvis, and one discovery raises an unsettling question: who, or what, had been waiting there all this time? When Elvis Presley bought Graceland in 1957, he was only 22 years old, but his life was already changing at a speed few could imagine. He paid $102,500 for the Memphis estate, transforming what had once been a wealthy family home into his own private kingdom. For a young man who had grown up in modest circumstances in Tupelo, Mississippi, Graceland represented more than success. It was proof that everything had changed. At first, the mansion was filled with life. Elvis brought his parents there, kept horses on the property, and even had an unusual chimpanzee named Scatter whose behavior became legendary among guests. Yet behind the spectacle was another side of Elvis that rarely appeared in public. One of his favorite places was the meditation garden, where he could step away from screaming fans and the constant demands of fame. Inside the mansion, every room seemed to reveal another part of his personality. The jungle room reflected his extravagant taste, while the basement television room allowed him to watch several programs at once. Even the racquetball court became a place where Elvis could relax, play music, and spend time with friends. Then everything changed on August 16, 1977. After Elvis died, Graceland stopped being simply a family home. It became a place of mourning, memory, and eventually pilgrimage. His father, Vernon Presley, took extraordinary precautions after concerns about the security of Elvis's original grave, and the family worked to protect the property and everything inside it. When Graceland opened to the public in 1982, fans could walk through many of the rooms Elvis had once occupied. They could see his clothes, his furniture, his personal spaces, and pieces of the extraordinary life he had built. But one place remained completely different. The staircase leading to the second floor was blocked. Visitors could look toward it, but they could go no farther. The explanation was always the same: the upstairs was private and would remain that way out of respect for the Presley family. That simple barrier only made the mystery more powerful. For decades, millions of people wondered what remained behind that closed door. Was it simply a preserved piece of Elvis's private life? Or were there memories the family never wanted the public to see? And there was an even darker reason that upstairs became so closely guarded. To understand why that door stayed closed for nearly 5 decades, we have to go back to the final afternoon of Elvis Presley's life. By the afternoon of August 16th, Elvis Presley had already spent years living under an unusual routine. His nights could stretch into the early morning, while the daylight hours were often reserved for sleep. To the people around him, that schedule was nothing unusual. But on this particular day, the quiet inside Graceland would soon become terrifying. Elvis was upstairs, resting in his bedroom while the mansion carried on around him. His fiancée, Ginger Alden, eventually woke and expected that he would still be nearby. Yet, as the afternoon progressed, something about the silence began to feel wrong. Around 2:30 p.m., Alden went to check on him. She knocked on the bathroom door but received no response. When she entered, she found Elvis unconscious on the floor, with his pajama bottoms around his ankles. Within moments, the atmosphere inside Graceland changed completely. Joe Esposito, one of Elvis's closest friends and road manager, rushed upstairs and attempted to revive him. Emergency services were contacted, and paramedics arrived at the estate before transporting Elvis to Baptist Memorial Hospital. They continued desperate efforts to save him, but nothing worked. At 3:30 p.m., Elvis Presley was pronounced dead. He was only 4. The shock was immediate. Radio stations interrupted their programs, television networks rushed out reports, and fans gathered around Graceland trying to process what seemed impossible. The man who had spent 2 decades defining rock and roll was suddenly gone. Officials initially attributed his death to cardiac arrhythmia, an abnormality of the heart's rhythm. But that explanation did not end the questions. Elvis had been struggling with serious health problems for years, and his physical condition had become increasingly difficult to hide. His weight had risen dramatically. Some later performances showed a performer who appeared exhausted, struggled with his movements, or seemed to lose his concentration. The contrast was disturbing. The same entertainer who once seemed unstoppable was visibly struggling behind the spectacle. Then came the toxicology findings. Several medications and substances were detected in Elvis's system, including codeine, Demerol, Dilaudid, Percodan, and the discovery intensified scrutiny of the treatment he had received and fueled a much larger debate over what had contributed to his decline. For the Presley family, however, the tragedy was far more personal. The upstairs rooms were now permanently connected to Elvis's final moments. Protecting that part of Graceland meant protecting memories that were painful enough without millions of strangers looking inside. Yet the questions surrounding Elvis's final years were not going to disappear. Soon attention turned toward the physician who had been treating him for more than a decade. His name was George Nicopolis, better known as Dr. Nick, and the record of medications connected to Elvis would become one of the most controversial chapters in the King's story. Behind Elvis Presley's declining health was a complicated relationship that would remain controversial long after his death. At the center of it was Dr. George Nicopolis, the physician known to Elvis and those around him as Dr. Nick Nicopolis began treating Elvis in 1967 and eventually became far more than a doctor who appeared during routine appointments. He traveled with the singer, shared time with his entourage, and became closely involved in managing the medications Elvis received. Then the numbers began to raise eyebrows. During the final 8 months of Elvis's life, Dr. Nick reportedly prescribed nearly 200 prescriptions containing more than 10,000 pills, capsules, and vials. The previous year, the total had reportedly approached 19,000 doses. Elvis was receiving medication so frequently that, on average, it amounted to more than one prescription every day. Friends also recalled Elvis carrying large quantities of medication with him, sometimes with enough bottles to resemble a traveling pharmacy. To critics, the situation seemed indefensible. How could a physician allow such an enormous supply to accumulate around a patient whose health was visibly deteriorating? Dr. Nick had a different explanation. He maintained that Elvis was dealing with legitimate medical problems, including chronic pain, glaucoma, and colitis. He also argued that his role was to control the situation rather than abandon Elvis to seek medications elsewhere. In his view, refusing to prescribe could have pushed the singer toward even more dangerous sources. But after Elvis died, that defense came under intense scrutiny. In 1980, Nicopolis was indicted on 14 counts, involving the excessive prescribing of controlled substances to Elvis and other patients. Prosecutors portrayed him as a physician who had gone far beyond responsible medical care. Yet the jury ultimately acquitted him, accepting the argument that Elvis might have obtained the substances regardless. The controversy did not end there. In 1995, the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners permanently revoked Nicopolis's medical license. By then, public opinion had largely transformed Dr. Nick into one of the most controversial figures connected to Elvis's final years. But there was another possibility that complicated the story. In 2020, author Sally A. Hodel argued in her book, Destined to Die Young, that Elvis's decline may not have been caused by medication dependence alone. She pointed to inherited medical conditions, including alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, which can affect the liver and lungs. Other health problems may also have contributed to the pain, fatigue, infections, and breathing difficulties Elvis experienced. That possibility doesn't erase the concerns surrounding his medication, but it suggests that the story of Elvis's decline may have been far more complicated than a simple tale of reckless prescribing. And while experts debated what had actually happened to the king, millions of fans were asking an entirely different question. What if Elvis Presley's story had not really ended on August 16, 1977? That question would soon give birth to one of the most persistent celebrity mysteries ever created. Elvis Presley may have been declared dead, but for some fans that was only the beginning of the story. Almost immediately after his death, disbelief turned into speculation. People who could not accept that the king was gone began claiming that Elvis had secretly disappeared and was living somewhere beyond the reach of the public. What started as whispers soon became a worldwide phenomenon. One of the earliest stories involved a man who allegedly purchased a plane ticket from Memphis to Buenos Aires using the name John Burroughs, a pseudonym associated with Elvis. Other supposed sightings followed. A woman in Michigan claimed she encountered Elvis while being served at Burger King before long. Reports placed him every